Distinguished speakers, dear participants, good evening, or good afternoon, or good morning to all who are watching us in different time zones. Welcome to the live Zoom webinar called Tunisia-Quo Vadis, the new constitutional reality, its impact and socio-political challenges. My name is Filip Šandor. I'm a director for the Mediterranean program at Platform for Peace and Humanity. And today we are going to talk about several aspects of the Tunisian transition since 2011, Arab Spring, and more specifically about the recent events since 2021, reflecting the new political transition and constitutional reality in the country. Tunisia has experienced turbulent times during the last decade. In particular, the Arab Spring sparked in this country and became an inspiration for others in the region. During the last decade, Tunisia had more than 10 governments ruling the country during the democratic transition. However, last year, in July, President Kais Saied, a leader with no political background, took advantage of public dissatisfaction to execute the self-coup. He suspended the parliament, dismissed the prime minister, and ruled by decree. This year, he dissolved the Supreme Judicial Council and replaced it with the new one, members of whom he could choose. Furthermore, in July, he organized a referendum to adopt a new constitution, which gives the president more powers and deviates from the last decade's curse of democratic transition. Although the majority of people voted in favor of this constitution, the turnout was only 30%. The country is balancing on the edge of democracy, and its foreign relations illustrate the geopolitical realities of the country in North Africa. Moreover, the economic challenges could easily add the fuel into an unstable political and social environment in the country. In this regard, today we are going to explore in three sections the political, economic, and geopolitical realities under the current situation in the country and the wider geopolitical situation in the region. To understand more about the complexities of Tunisia and the current political and geopolitical environment, I am very happy to introduce our distinguished speakers. Professor Gordon Gray from the Penn State School of International Affairs is the former US ambassador to Tunisia from 2009 to 2012, witnessing the start of the Arab Spring and directing the US response in support of Tunisia's transition. Gordon also served on several positions as an advisor in the MENA region. We are really glad to have you today, Gordon. Sarah Yerkes is a senior fellow in Carnegie's Middle East program. Sarah's research focuses on Tunisia's political, economic, and security developments, as well as state-society relations in the Middle East and North Africa. Sarah also served as a foreign affairs officer in the State Department's Office of Israel and Palestinian Affairs and as a geopolitical research analyst at the Pentagon. Sarah, thank you for joining us today. And Riccardo Fabiani is the project director for North Africa at the International Crisis Group. Riccardo oversees crisis groups' work on Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, and Algeria, and has more than 10 years of professional experience as a political analyst and economist on North Africa. We are glad to join us, you today, Riccardo, and to all of our audience, all who are watching us now. You will have an opportunity to ask questions that we will answer after the main intervention of our speakers. Please specify to whom you are addressing your question or whether it is a question for all. Thank you very much. So, my first question in a political section, I would like to pass to you, Gordon. Perhaps you could start with sharing with us your insights into the Tunisia's political environment. And my other question is this the end of the most successful story of the Arab Spring wave since 2011?
Well, thank you for inviting me to speak with two distinguished observers of Tunisia. I'm looking forward to the discussion today. Just to give a little bit of background as far as recent developments, as you pointed out, since 2011, when Ben Ali was forced to flee Tunis in the wake of massive protests against his authoritarian rule, there have been far too many governments in Tunisia which have not been successful in meeting the aspirations of the people for greater economic opportunity. This came at the same time as a number of economic crises, which further hurt both the Tunisian economy and, more importantly, the Tunisian people as a result. So fast forwarding to the presidential elections in 2019, there was great dissatisfaction with the established political class, if you will. And after the first round of presidential voting, two candidates who were viewed as outsiders in a political sense won the top two positions and qualified for the runoff. One was Nabil Karoui, who was certainly an establishment figure in terms of being a media tycoon, but had not run for office before. And the other was Kais Saied, who was a constitutional professor of constitutional law in Tunis, who was not particularly well known either. The fact that they were the two top vote getters just shows the great dissatisfaction among the Tunisian people with the status quo. And there was, as there had been since the revolution, there was a very peaceful transition of power. President Said took over. But fast forward a year and a half from his assuming power to July 25th, 2021, he undertook a number of unconstitutional measures, such as freezing parliament, invoking Article 80 of the Tunisian Constitution, which was of dubious relevance. It calls for the existence of a imminent danger before it is done. That's highly debatable, but certainly his further actions are not debatable. You mentioned some of them in your introduction. He then kind of pivoted to addressing what I would call his vanity project, which was writing a new constitution, which, as you noted, was passed with 30%. The figure I had seen actually is 28% of popular the popular participation. It was a real farce. The handpicked committee that he selected delivered a text to him. He even rejected that text, and Tunisian people had less than 3 weeks to look at the text and vote on it. It's no surprise that the turnout was so low. And I'd contrast that with the very extensive, wide-ranging consultations that in the run-up to the constitution that was ratified by Parliament in January 2014. It was a two and a half year process. Civil society was consulted, and again, a legitimately elected parliament was able to debate it and decide it. So that's where we are today. Looking forward 9 days, there are going to be parliamentary elections, which I think if they get a 28% turnout, I'll be surprised. the 12 major parties are boycotting the elections. The union has cast doubt, the UGTT, on their legitimacy. There've been a number of undemocratic measures that decreed by Said. All of these, I think, will serve to dampen the vote. As for your second question, is this the end of the Arab Spring? To be a diplomat, and particularly to be a diplomat in Middle East, North Africa, you have to maintain optimism. I like to believe in the comment or observation attributed to Martin Luther King that the arc of history tends to bend toward justice. So I remain an eternal optimist, but there's certainly the events of the last 2.5 years would make a less optimistic observer question whether we're going in the right direction or not.
Thank you very much for this very interesting comment. You mentioned also the elections we are heading towards in a few days. However, this election is under the new constitution. Maybe Sarah, in your last article, you described the constitutional change, the impact of the constitutional changes for the next parliamentary election. Could you perhaps describe more about this change which were made?
Sure. Thank you so much. It's great to be with all of you on screen. I think what we've seen from both the Constitution and then the electoral law that came out shortly thereafter that governs these elections is, first of all, there's sort of a paradox. On the one hand, these elections really don't matter that much. I mean, I think, we, including myself, have spent a good amount of time sort of analyzing the electoral law and analyzing what this all means. But at the end of the day, what I keep sort of coming back to is, does any of it really matter? I mean, this parliament, based on the new constitution, has very, very little power. Because of, as Gordon, described, almost every single political actor is boycotting this. We expect a very low turnout. There are several constituencies where no one is even running for office, which is quite remarkable, 11 years after a democratic transition. So, what we can see is that this parliament, when it does come to power, is mostly going to be sort of a form of theater, I think. This will be a way for President Said to sort of scapegoat some of the problems in Tunisia. Right now, he has all the power in his own hands. He is the ultimate arbiter of everything. But once he has this parliament there, who will mostly be made up of, people who support him, then he can point to them and say, oh, we're not meeting your needs in the health sector or education, or, that road's not getting fixed. Well, it's not my fault. I am so sorry. I am the leader, but the parliament is the one who's in charge of that issue, and it's their fault. And we see this. This is a very typical pattern for authoritarian governments. But to go back to your question, I think, when we look at what the actual electoral law looks like, it's just the latest in many, many legal measures that this constitutional law professor has put forward. He knows exactly what he's doing when he makes these sorts of changes. And there are a lot of just really troubling measures in the law itself on candidacy, how the really just sort of burdensome requirements on candidates to even register to run for office, which did prevent many people from being able to meet those high requirements. But I think one of the most troubling things that we saw is that he removed gender quotas as well as quotas for youth and others. And this is something, Tunisia, since independence, has really prided itself on being a leader in the region and globally on gender equality. And Tunisia has made, remarkable strides in promoting women's empowerment in the political sphere, as well as in education and in the workforce. And Said has, kind of erased a lot of that through just not even acknowledging the need for gender quotas. And we've seen the results come out. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but the number of female candidates is way, way lower than it's been in any other previous election. And so I think he's doing a real disservice to Tunisia and to these women's movements, many of whom have been his supporters in, sort of erasing the gender quotas. So there's restrictions from the first step of registering all the way through the role of parliamentarians once they're in office. And another big issue that I'll point to is the sort of campaign finance. And, Said is someone who has his real main issue on the campaign trail was anti-corruption, but we've seen him do virtually nothing to actually fight corruption. And one of the things that he changed in the electoral law was basically making it easier for politicians to be corrupt in their campaign financing by removing some of the public financing. It's making it so that really only people who have means are able to run for office. And that really goes against this ethos that he tries to put forward of being a man of the people and trying to be fighting corruption. So a lot of really, really troubling things that go into this. But again, at the end of the day, I don't know that it really matters how hard it is to run for office when the position you're going to get is really, really toothless in the end anyway.
Thank you very much. Indeed, very interesting. You mentioned women and burdening the women for going to the to candidate. However, there is a woman in charge as a prime minister. Riccardo, I would like to ask you something about rule of law, human rights in the country after the suspension of parliament, and are those principles going where are those principles going?
Yeah, I think it's a very legitimate question, given that the president, since the power grab, the July 21 power grab, tried to reassure regularly about the fact that the country wouldn't necessarily stray away from respect of human rights and basic civil and political rights. Now, what we are seeing, of course, is not some sort of generalized, top-down authoritarian repression. We cannot, of course, compare Qais Said's Tunisia to other authoritarian systems across the region. But what we are seeing is that there's increasing pressure and I would say targeted arrests and persecution of opposition leaders, civil society groups, and then there is a tightening of, the space for expressing criticism against the president, and more in general, even there's been talk about the possibility of even closing the possibility of civil society groups receiving foreign funding, even though this is not yet a law, but it's a possibility, it's a suggestion that has been made. I think more in general, what we are looking at here in Tunisia is a very curious political model, where on the one hand, the president has this very sort of abstract, top-down, very formalistic understanding of political power and the institutions, right? He believes that if you just issue a new constitution, if you just approve a new law, all of a sudden magically power will materialize in your hands and you will be able to run a country. The reality is that power is a much more complex and subtle mechanism. It's often informal, especially in developing countries. And to run a country, to govern effectively a country, you need the support and a certain degree of consensus by, informal groups, factions, and so on within the government, outside the government, patronage networks, and so on and so forth. And the president doesn't control any of that and doesn't even try to control them because he doesn't really understand how political power is actually articulated outside of the abstraction of constitutional law and that kind of thing. The reality is that he has a very, as I said, abstract and superficial and formal understanding of how power is articulated, and seeing that the country does not respond as he expects to his top-down impositions, he is relying increasingly on the security apparatus. Initially was the army. The army had a pretty big role to play in the July 2021 power grab. And we are seeing it in the targeted arrests and in the repression of, as I said, civil society and so on and so forth. It's a very, unfortunate, I would say, situation which the security apparatus de facto represents then the backbone of a very insecure political power that does not control the country and is following blindly a roadmap that he has, very single-handedly conceived of and imposed on the whole country without consulting anyone, whether in the opposition, whether even within its own ranks, right? The president is even losing support from, or is receiving criticism at the very least, from those organizations that are meant to support him, or that, or even from the major trade union, UGTT, which was always trying to position itself as a fairly neutral or equidistant actor between the president and the opposition. Even the UGTT is becoming more critical and more vocal in its criticism towards the president. So the reality is that we are stuck in a very vicious cycle where the repression and the human rights violations are only likely to become more frequent because the president doesn't control the country, and because he doesn't control the country, can only rely on the only real constituency that still seems to support him, which is the army and the security apparatus. The big question, however, is how long, for how long this, security forces will be ready to support him. Right, at some point, this could change, and I think this is probably the biggest risk he faces at the moment.
Thank you. Indeed, very, very interesting. Let's move then to the political section. I will perhaps in the reverse order. How is the economic shape of Tunisia right now, Riccardo? To the question for you, was this the main reason why people were dissatisfied with the politicians?
I would argue that there was of course last year very clearly a lot of dissatisfaction towards the outcome of the 2011 uprising. Right, the idea is that after 2011 there was a redefinition of the mechanisms for decision making. Right, there was a discussion of how decisions should be taken. There was part of the Constituent Assembly work and the new constitution and the idea, the commitment to democracy and so on. There was I would say, broad consensus on that 10 years ago. The problem is that there was in the, if we want to call it revolutionary camp, a fundamental disagreement or divergence regarding the issue of the redistribution of assets and wealth and revenues more in general, following the 2011 uprising. It's quite clear that one part of the revolutionary camp, or at least of the Tunisian population, expected that with the uprising, there would be also a different socioeconomic model in place. This never materialized. The shortest, let's say, the path of least resistance became in the following years, increasing the, let's say, the number of people who would receive the redistribution of patronage benefits, so that all those constituencies of those groups that had been excluded or at least marginalized under Ben Ali would now be included within the same redistribution of revenues, within the same redistribution and creation of wealth. That's sort of, if you like, increasing of the receiving of the group that became decided to receive these benefits was not sustainable, because there was no fundamental restructuring of the economy, nor fundamental agreement and consensus, most importantly, on economic priorities. Right, there was no commitment to a 10 or 20 year, let's say, industrial policy or long-term economic plan for the development of the country. And the country effectively got stuck in this sort of vicious cycle, where there was no commitment to long-term development. There was just more redistribution of the same revenues along the same patterns and the same lines. The country effectively resorted to debt and foreign debt to try and plug the gap between these two, between the long-term development, the lack of long-term development and the redistribution of benefits. And it gradually became evident that this was not just unsustainable, but it actually, I would say, led to a deterioration of the overall socioeconomic picture. So the answer basically to your question is this is a socioeconomic crisis, but it's also a governance crisis. There's a fundamental divergence that started in 2011 that became more evident over time, and has empowered somebody who has promised to fix this, but actually has no plan to fix this, has no idea of how to do it, because he has no economic understanding of, first of all, of economic affairs. He doesn't have any understanding of political power, and he's just trying to follow a very sort of isolated and abstract plan. And as he's doing that, he keeps losing support across the Tunisian society, but also very soon even within the constituency that support them.
Okay, very, very, very interesting. There was a loan from the IMF. Sarah, could you please describe how desperately Said needs this loan, and what is the balance between this loan and the preconditions for which he needs he wants this loan from the IMF to change the country, for example, the public sphere. So there are some conditions for the receiving such a loan from the international community. So is he balancing so far between this large amount of money and the public dissatisfaction with the reforms?
I think that, I mean, everything that Riccardo said is absolutely true, that Said doesn't have a plan. He's not well versed in economic matters. And so he's been in this difficult situation where he, on the one hand, absolutely, I think, understands the need for an IMF deal, and not just because of the funds that deal would provide, but more importantly, what he hopes is that once the IMF actually signs this deal, right now they have a staff level agreement and they are expected to vote on the full agreement this month. Once if they go forward with this, then he hopes that this is going to unlock all sorts of other financing from the international community. And what we've seen since the self-coup a year and a half ago is that most of the both international donors and as well as the private sector have been really scared off by Said's actions. We've seen a sort of steady decrease in ratings by different agencies on their confidence in Tunisia. And so I think Said naively believes that as soon as this deal is done, he's going to have sort of solved all of Tunisia's economic problems. I don't think that's likely to happen. What we're seeing, in fact, is since the announcement of the staff level agreement, even more and more private sector companies are leaving Tunisia. We're seeing people really kind of lose faith in the country, in part because of the economic situation, but in large part because of the governance challenges that have been mentioned. The conditions that are in this deal are nothing new. The conditions have been in multiple IMF deals. These are things that have been well known to Tunisia for a long time. And successive governments have either been unwilling or unable to enact them. A lot of the conditions will cause short-term pain for Tunisia. And I think, the government, for example, of Youssef Chahed, the prime minister, tried to push through some austerity measures, tried to push through some attempts at addressing some of these things. And the big things are subsidy reform, privatization of some of the state-owned enterprises, as well as getting the public sector wage bill under control. At one time, Tunisia had the largest public sector wage bill in the entire world. So these are things, again, that are not brand new. They're not new to Said. But even someone like Youssef Chahed, who really took this on as one of the things he wanted to do, is really enact the IMF conditionality, came up short, was not able to do this because of some public pressure, and also just internal government pressure. And one of the big factors here, we've mentioned the labor union, the UGTT, a couple of times. They play a really big role here. They have been able to kind of slow down any of these sorts of reforms. They've been very vocal time and time again, and this time is no different, that these are red lines for them. They are absolutely not willing to accept some of the subsidy reforms, some of the privatization. And, when you look at the economic situation Tunisia is in right now, particularly in the wake of the pandemic and in the wake of the war between Russia and Ukraine, Tunisia is really suffering. And some of the things that are really, doing the worst right now are these areas with subsidies, fuel prices, food prices, these things that, the IMF is calling for lowering subsidies. But if you do that, you're going to make goods that are already unaffordable even less affordable. So Saeed, in a way, is in a very, very difficult position. But on the other hand, it's a position of his own making, that he came into power, and even after he initiated his self-coup, he had every opportunity. He has all the power in his own hands. If he wanted to push through reforms, if he wanted to sort of make changes, he could have. And instead, he spent all his time and energy on creating a new constitution, which is not something anyone was calling for. I mean, I think we sort of forget, while there was all this sort of frustration and anger, and I think rightly placed at a ineffective parliament, ineffective political parties, people were not asking for a new constitution. They were asking, though, for more jobs, for better jobs, for less inflation, for prices and things that they could afford. And Saeed never spent a single second trying to tackle any of that. He's instead pushed through this constitution and this new political system that doesn't appear to be any more likely to solve these economic problems than the previous system was.
Thank you very much. Gordon, from the perspective of US, there is for sure some development aid, military aid, but the military aid was cut in half last month. Geoeconomically, why there are no sanctions, for example, from the US or other states to Tunisia?
I think that the problem with sanctions is that they would hurt the Tunisian people without at all changing Saeed's calculus. We don't have, the United States does not have that much trade with Tunisia. There isn't that much that that we could sanction. It would have to be a very blunt instrument. And I think the other side of the coin is that if the United States is going to start sanctioning authoritarian regimes, as Riccardo had suggested in his remarks, Tunisia is not the worst by a long shot. So we would have to be sanctioning at least half the countries, if not more, in the world. It wouldn't have any effect. It would hurt the people in those countries. It wouldn't have a political effect and would hurt the U.S. economy. I think in terms of the bilateral U.S.-Tunisian relationship, the greater danger for the health of the bilateral relationship and for Tunisia is not that the U.S. is going to get to the point that it's going to even consider sanctions. The real danger is that the United States is just going to move on from Tunisia and ignore it. I think, well, as you pointed out, congressional support for assistance to Tunisia is already declining. It used to be that there was a very compelling reason to support Tunisia, which was that it started the Arab Spring and that it had many successful transitions of power and looked as if it was on a very positive trajectory. And that argument, sadly, is not one that congressional supporters of assistance to Tunisia can cite with a straight face. And I think the bilateral relationship is going to suffer as a result, and that doesn't help Tunisia any.
I understand. Thank you. Riccardo, from the perspective of the European Union, we know that Tunisia is the neighboring country to the European Union. There are also no sanctions from the European Union. Also, the same question, why? And is there the reason from energy or migration? Could you perhaps describe this more?
So the position of the main European actors, and obviously when we say Europe here, we mean mainly France, Italy, and the European Union, and then probably we could add to this Germany. The position has been clear from I wouldn't say the beginning, but at least over the past few months, there is no interest or no desire to really challenge or go against President Kais Saied. The French and the Italians are very clear on this. They need the support and the partnership of Tunisia for migration control purposes, but also they're worried about the repercussions of instability in Tunisia over Libya on the one hand, but also more in general over the Sahel and over the rest of North Africa. This is an area that is going through a process of, I would say, polarization. On the one hand, we have the polarization between Algeria and Morocco. We have a situation in Libya that has, I would say, I don't want to say stabilized, but where the degree of violence, the level of violence has gone down for sure, but it still remains extremely precarious. And most importantly, there are other geopolitical priorities right now in Europe, which are obviously the war in Ukraine and I would say, and energy security. And energy security depends to a large extent also on the stability of North Africa. So over the past months, I would say the Europeans have made very clear that the authoritarian drift in Tunisia is not a priority, is not an issue. The French have really adjusted their discourse, their language to the new reality. They feel targeted, they feel threatened even by Kais Saied's very strong, I would say, rhetoric. Kais Saied is somebody who places a lot of emphasis on national sovereignty, on rejecting foreign interferences. And the French obviously are, the biggest suspects when he talks about those things. So the French have really adjusted to this kind of new climate. And this is not just Tunisia, by the way. We hear the same type of rhetoric in the Sahel, in North Africa. There is a new wave coming, from both the local elites and from the population of, I would say, rejecting, or at least a certain frustration and disenchantment with the West and with Europe in particular, and France being the former colonial power, obviously it feels more targeted than any other country. So bottom line is that there is a desire to not rock the boat. They're just sitting by, they're watching. The Europeans, they don't, of course, I think there is a degree of illusion as well. There is a certain illusion that Kais Saied can stabilize Tunisia, can become the interlocutor and the partner that they haven't had for the past 10 years in the Tunisian democratic elite. I think it's an illusion because, again, as I said at the beginning, it's not clear how sustainable this very precarious balance is, and whether even in the short to medium term, this is actually in the interests of Europe and the Europeans. But as I said, when we look at the balance between the interests of Rome and Paris versus Brussels, at least initial attempts to put pressure on Tunis and on Kais Saied, I would say the balance has now is now quite clearly in favor of France and Italy. They are really dictating the European agenda on Tunisia right now.
Yeah, they are indeed very strong in the southern neighbors region. And if EU member state put their veto on the consensus mechanism on foreign policy, indeed nothing will happen. Tunisia is not isolated, as we heard. Sarah, could you perhaps describe maybe the impact from the war in Ukraine on Tunisia's situation? I assume there is a problem with the grain and inflation, energy crisis. How this can end in Tunisia? What the ultimate end of the Ukrainian crisis can impact the the Tunisia situation?
Sure. Yeah, I think, we've seen, this is not unique to Tunisia at all, but we've seen the reliance on grain from both Ukraine and Russia that has been a real problem. We've seen food shortages and rising inflation, as well as on gasoline as well, lines at gas stations that we have not seen in years and years. The situation has not necessarily created these problems, but it's exacerbated the existing problems related to inflation and shortages. And then also politically, I think for Said, he, on the one hand, has tried to sort of continue Tunisia's neutral foreign policy. But on the other hand, we've seen him sort of cozying up to Russia in a way that makes a lot of the West pretty uncomfortable. There were rumors, I think back in April, that Said was going to go to Russia. This is right in the heat of the beginning of this conflict, in order to sort of greet a Tunisian astronaut that was going up to the International Space Station with Russia. He didn't end up going on that trip, but the fact that in his mind he would think this was a good idea just shows how inexperienced he is in the foreign policy realm, and that he's not. And again, this is not unique to Tunisia, but he's not been willing to sort of take the anti-Russian stance that a lot of the European and American partners would like to see him do, whether in the UN or just kind of vocally. And so, he's in a sort of strange position where he's sort of, in a way, cozying up to Russia, but not really getting much out of that. And but the biggest impact has been the economy, for sure.
Thank you very much, Gordon. What were the reactions from other Arab states on the political turmoil and new constitution and dissolution of parliament? What were the reactions, and are they satisfied with the current situation in Tunisia? Are they supporting the president?
I would say that some of the authoritarian governments in the region that you might expect to, if not welcome, at least acquiesce to what Said has done in the past year and a half or so. That was a public stance. I defer to my colleagues on the panel to correct me if I recall correctly. Egyptians quickly sent a delegation. There was a lot of interestingly, though, there was a lot of speculation that the Saudis and or the Emiratis at the governmental level would step in to provide some kind of economic support, some kind of loan package. That has not been the case. And that's in marked contrast to, say, what we saw with Egypt. I think the biggest source of support has been Algeria, which has helped out economically. Algeria, understandably, has a strong interest in seeing stability in Tunisia, and it's hardly a democratic government, so it's not going to be overly concerned with what Said has done. And we've also seen some missteps. As Sarah mentioned, Said does not have any particular experience in foreign affairs, and he overturned, I think inadvertently, a long-standing policy of Tunisian neutrality on the Western Sahara question by welcoming the so-called head of the Serhawi government to Tunis during an African summit. And that was not exactly one of his swiftest moves in terms of advancing Tunisian interests.
Okay, thank you very much. I assume that Turkey and Qatar didn't agree with what happened in Tunisia. Let's perhaps move to the Q&A section. We have one question. What does the Tunisia's short midterm 2023 outlook mean for neighboring Libya? We can start with Riccardo.
Well, it's hard to answer the question simply because I don't know what is the outlook for Tunisia in 2023, to be honest with you. And I suspect that we might see, more instability in Tunisia than we might be ready for. I wouldn't, by any means, I wouldn't say that the end of the roadmap and the beginning of this new political phase is the end of the story. So this is the first issue. The second issue is that the Libyan context, as I was mentioning before, has to an extent become less unstable or less violent, less precarious than it's been for several years. And this is mostly because the foreign actors that were previously very much involved in the Libyan conflict have really disengaged from it and have also started a process of partial regional reconciliation, let's say. So there is literally no major country or regional power that is right now interested in fueling a new round of violence in Libya. This has led to a very, I would say, uneasy stalemate, where there is no progress on the Libyan file, there is no progress towards some sort of transition or peace or end of the conflict or end of the division of the country. But at the same time, there is also no war, no major nationwide, let's say, conflict. So the repercussions of the Libyan conflict on Tunisia and the repercussions of Tunisian instability on the Libyan conflict have actually gone down quite a lot, exactly because of this sort of precarious, uneasy stalemate or uneasy situation in both countries. Now, if Tunisia were to become less stable, let's say, if the situation were to precipitate in Tunisia, if there were some sort of uprising or coup or whatever, that could obviously have an impact on the Libyan context. But as I said, in terms of security, direct security repercussions, or even economic repercussions, I would say the situation has relatively, I think I underline the use of this word, relatively, I would say, eased over the past few years.
Thank you very much. Sarah, do you want to comment on this question? Tunisia's short mid-term outlook, what does it mean for Libya?
I think I agree with
Okay.
Riccardo. I think right now we're not really seeing too many dramatic implications.
So, question for all: what role is Tunisia playing in containing the migration waves from Africa into Europe, and what are the prospects for the region in playing a more human rights compliant role in the migration challenges? I was talking with you, Sarah, so you can start now.
Sure. Well, I think actually one of the most interesting pieces of this is actually Tunisian migration to Europe, not just sub-Saharan African migration. We've seen dramatic increases over the past couple of years in Tunisians who are just fed up with all the issues we've been talking about and trying to, and getting on boats and risking their lives and trying to get to Italy. And so, yeah, Tunisia, I mean, they play an important role as both a transit area and a forget the word I'm looking for, sorry, but a jumping off point for Tunisians, but as well as sub-Saharan Africans. And I think, like we've seen in many of the North African countries, that their relationship with Europe is in large part influenced by that migration challenge. And one of the reasons I think that we've seen France and the EU and others be sort of more willing to look past some of Said's anti-democratic behaviors because of the the desire to maintain at least short-term stability. I think that's actually sort of the wrong approach, that long-term stability will come about from a more open and free society and not from a authoritarian system. But for now, France and others in Italy are most focused on trying to stem this migration problem. And I mean, on the broader human rights question, I think that Said, this is not an issue that Said is very focused on, is very concerned with. We haven't seen him pay even lip service really to sort of the human rights issue. And we've seen a lot of, really sort of horrible incidents just of the past couple of weeks and months of really sad stories of migration attempts that have gone wrong, and plus brain drain as well. I mean, this is another, there's the irregular migration and the regular migration, where we're seeing more and more Tunisians who are just fed up with the lack of socioeconomic development, with the poor sort of the health situation, the education system, and wanting to go to Europe, wanting to go to Canada, the United States, and not wanting to come back. And so I think Tunisia is really losing, people across the board, from different regions and from different socioeconomic levels and in professions. And, the more hopeless people feel, the less willing they are to stay.
Thank you very much. Gordon, do you want to add something to this intervention for this question?
No, I think I would agree with everything that was just said. I just point out something that may be obvious. There's been a big difference between the way European countries have welcomed refugees from Ukraine and the way they've welcomed refugees from Syria or crossing the Mediterranean from either North Africa or sub-Saharan Africa. And I don't want to just point the finger at Europe. You can make the same criticism of the United States.
Yes, I completely understand. This is the reality we are facing. Riccardo, perhaps do you want something to add to the question?
Yeah, maybe I can add. I think Sarah made a very interesting point about the fact that this has become a Tunisian phenomenon, right? When we look at migration, we're looking at Tunisians attempting the crossing of the Mediterranean, which is different from the peak of the migration crisis from the Italian perspective back in 2015, when the issue was Libya and it was sub-Saharan Africans trying to use Libya as a departure point to get to Italy. Interestingly enough, this year in 2022, there's been a real spike in migration, or whatever, the number of migrants going from Tunisia to Italy. Tunisia has now become the biggest source of illegal or regular, let's say, migration to Italy, which obviously, as Sarah was pointing out, explains very well why Italy is very keen on, supporting Kayseri, making sure that there is a strongman and a partner they can do business with, because obviously their biggest concern is migration. And indeed, now Italy has a very right-wing government in place, and there was a major standoff between Italy and France, well, and actually the rest of Europe only a few weeks ago, because Italy refused that that a ship basically docked in Sicily, and basically refused that these migrants disembark and get into the Italian territory. And France eventually was forced, let's say, to accept this ship. So, if anything, the outlook for migration and the respect of human rights is only going to get worse. As it was said, Kayseri has no real, let's say, attention or focus on this topic. The Europeans are very much willing to trade, their interest or their focus on democracy and human rights for migration control. And the type of government that is in power in a place like Italy is very keen on making sure that the numbers go down at whatever cost, right, at whatever price. So there is no interest whatsoever in promoting the respect of human rights at this stage.
Thank you very much. We have another question. Do you think Tunisia's situation could have an impact in Egypt, whose population is also getting disappointed by the President al-Sisi's regime? Who would like to comment on this? Perhaps Sarah, starting with you.
Sure. I honestly don't think Egyptians are looking that much at what happens in Tunisia. I think the other way around. I think Egypt has had a big impact on, at various points during Egypt's failed transition, on Tunisia. But I honestly, I think that given Egypt's sort of geopolitical importance and stature, Tunisia is seen a little bit as this tiny little place that's, it's not actually geographically that far away, but it's not really relevant in the minds of most Egyptians. However, I will say that, Tunisia, the success of Tunisia prior to 2019, I think was a seed of inspiration, not a major beacon of inspiration to activists around the Arab world, but I think a seed of inspiration. I do think, for example, if you look at the Algerian Hirak movement that sprung up, in 2018, 2019, that movement, you can see some connection. The idea that democratic success was on its way next door in Tunisia, I think did help inspire some of the Algerian activists to try to unseat Bouteflika and try to move forward. But I really don't think that that either success or failure in Tunisia has much of an impact on Egypt.
Thank you very much. Riccardo, Gordon, do you want to comment on this question? It's a question for all.
No, I think Sarah summed it up very well, I think.
Okay. 4 more minutes. I would like to ask every one of you. We heard a lot about politics, economy, geopolitical realities. We are heading to the new election in a few days. How do you see this regime? Will this regime survive in next year, or will it change to something completely different? Please be brief on this question. Thank you. So Riccardo, maybe we can start with you.
I think we are in the realm of speculation, of course, here, because nobody really knows what will happen and when it will happen, if it will happen. What I can relate here is rumors and conversations that we've been hearing, is that there is at least a part of the population and observers that believe at some point the situation, given the deterioration in the political relations between the president and the rest of the political spectrum, given the fact that the president doesn't really have, given the fact that his, let's say, support base is getting more and more narrow, given the fact that there's a socioeconomic crisis and there is a very difficult IMF deal that will need to be at some point forced upon the population, and it's unclear how that will be done. So the risk is that there could be at some point a decision by the security forces. We don't know who, we don't know how, we don't know when, that could decide to intervene and decide that enough is enough, and that betting on the president, implicitly betting on the president, was a wrong move, and that Tunisia is better off following a different arrangement. What could be that arrangement? I don't think we would necessarily see some sort of military dictatorship. It's more likely that the army could shepherd some sort of new transition, some sort of civilian role in it. Again, this is pure speculation, but I do think that there's a risk, an increasing risk, that at some point this could happen exactly because of the isolation of the president.
Thank you very much, Gordon. How do you see the next development?
Well, I don't think that the elections are going to have much effect one way or the other on what happens in 2023. Given the likely low turnout, given the number of parties boycotting them, given the difficulty of real candidates running, that's not going to change the equation. So, as Riccardo rightly said, we move into the realm of speculation. The question boils down to what is the patience of the Tunisian people? What is the patience of other power centers? And I would say there are three three power centers. One are the security forces, one is civil society, and one is the union, the UGTT. And I think what will force their hand is how bad the economy gets. And as Sarah has suggested, the IMF loan, assuming it's approved in 2 weeks, is not going to be a silver bullet that's going to solve Tunisians' economic problems.
Okay, thank you. And the same question, the final question to Sarah.
Sure. I mean, I agree. I think that the president has been hemorrhaging support and he is increasingly isolated. But I think he has the ability to hold on at least until 2024, when there potentially are the next presidential elections. We don't know if he's going to have restarted the calendar with the new constitution, or if he will stick to that, or if he'll just decide he wants to keep going, or if he'll step down before then once he sort of achieves his plan. I don't think that's very likely. But I think the big question is, as we've heard, as people continue to suffer economically, as they continue to suffer politically, are they able to unite? And I fear, again, very much in the speculation realm, but I fear that what we will see is increasing polarization, increasing repression. That Said has not yet been tested with really massive uprisings, with massive pushback against what he's doing and against his regime. And so I fear that if we do manage to see civil society unite, right now they are fully divided, very, very polarized, and not really willing to take the sort of risks necessary to push back against him. If that changes and we see, a Arab Spring 2.0, I fear Said would turn to those security forces, who I also fear would be I don't think the military, but I do think the police and internal security would be willing to use repression to push back. So I don't know. I also worry, there's no real successor to Said. If he were to die tomorrow, I do not know who would take over. There's not a clear succession plan, and there's no one from any of the different bodies that seems really poised or able to take over and to move Tunisia in a better direction, or to address the challenges that it faces today.
Thank you very much. I would wish to speak more hours about these realities, but indeed it was very, very interesting. Thank you very much to all our distinguished speakers. It was Professor Gordon Gray from the Penn State School of International Affairs, Sarah Yerkes from the Carnegie's Middle East program, and Riccardo Fabiani from the International Crisis Group. Thank you very much again, and I wish you a nice day or nice evening, and thank you very much. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.